So today we're going to skim the surface of artificial neural networks. And I want to flag that this is an entire topic in and of itself, right? This is an emerging field with lots of different technologies coming onto the market. There are lots of different kinds of ways in which you can conceptualize artificial neural networks, including the more recent efforts to integrate things from different disciplines. There are lots of different ways in which we can conceptualize neural networks. And so we'll just look at a couple of different methods that have been proven and already been put out into markets, into products that are on the market. And then we'll just sort of set you up so that way you know where to explore and go next in your journey learning AI. Before we dive into neural networks, I want to take a moment to go over some fundamentals around what we mean when we say a model learns. So a typical learning workflow goes like this. You subset your data, taking a set of examples. We call this our training data set, and we use this to build our model. The model takes in an example one at a time, provides a prediction, compares the prediction with the actual value, and then updates the solution. It then repeats this process with every single example in your entire training data set. However, the devil is in the details. Let's take an example of the simple linear regression model. The goal of this model training process, right, is to make your model less wrong. So we use a concept called loss. Loss is something that comes from statistics, is used across machine learning, and is also used in the context of neural networks. So loss measures the difference between your predicted and actual values. Some common metrics that are then used to measure model improvements are built on loss, right? So mean squared error is basically the average of the sum of squared losses across a set of examples. And the simpler mean absolute error is the average loss across examples, right? So these are ways for you to measure whether or not your model is actually improving and to be able to really figure out, right, how wrong is my model? Is it useful yet? So the goal of model training really becomes reducing whatever loss metric you've chosen. A common approach to model training is to use a mathematical method known as gradient descent. Here, one iteratively searches, for instance, for the weight and bias values that result in the lowest loss. The weights are randomized to near zero to begin with, and then we choose a direction to adjust the weights, right? Either incrementing or decrementing them. And you just do that slowly and you monitor the impact on loss, right? Seems simple in theory, but there's a couple of things that we need to do to really be able to instrument our code and see how the model is improving over time, or if it's actually just getting worse based on our changes. So if you plot your loss over time, that is over the number of model iterations that you've run, what you end up with is a graph that depicts when your model stops improving or converges. In this case, we see convergence in our linear model around the 1,000th iteration, right? So you can kind of see these changes over time, and we then get to that final piece where our model has basically settled. Okay, so the last couple of quick concepts, right? I want to talk about hyperparameters, right? Where earlier we were thinking about weight and loss as the essential parameters of our model. Hyperparameters are these meta knobs that we use to control our training workflow. Every problem, data set, and model have their own ideals for these ones, right? So their own ideal training rate, ideal batch size, and number of epochs. And these are things that you really need to tinker with when you tune your model. So when someone talks about tuning their hyperparameters, they're basically just saying that they're adjusting the number of times that they're running through the model, the size of the data that they're feeding the model, and the rate at which they're moving through that gradient descent process. Learning rate is basically a number that influences how quickly the model converges. It determines what that small amount is that you step in your gradient descent. And you can kind of look at these 4 different graphs to see the influence of a big or small or learning rate on your actual model performance. And you're really asking the question of what is enough, right? Sometimes if it's too small, you don't actually achieve conversions. If it's too big, you might have wild fluctuations or even just like a drastic increase in the loss towards the end, right? It's a little bit tricky to try and figure out exactly what works. And so oftentimes we suggest, right, pick a number, start with it. And again, treat it like your weight and loss. You're incrementing or decrementing until you figure out what works well for your specific model. Batch size then refers to how many examples the model should process before updating itself. An epoch then refers to the model processing every example in the training set once. So in this example that we have on the screen, we have a training set of 1,000 examples with a mini batch size of 100 examples. So it'll take the model 10 iterations to complete one epoch. And so there are a lot more knobs that you can tinker with to determine how much time and effort a model needs to spend in training before it's really ready for evaluation. And these are just a couple that you can start with so that way you can kind of see the impact of, right, your learning rate, your batch size, and your epochs on the outcomes of your model or even the loss of your model. And just like that, you'll have a trained model that is ready for use with new data. And of course, there are lots more things that you can think about in this case, but I would argue that this is at least a good first cut for you to get a basic sense of how training itself works before you then take your trained machine learning model and then use it in practice, whether it's evaluating its performance to be able to compare predicted values with actual values or actually putting it through the paces in a real world application. The thing to note here is that when you first build a model, it's untrained. It actually doesn't know correct from incorrect yet. And so it means when we talk about architectures later on in this lecture, you'll need to remember that each of those different neural networks will need to be trained with a specific set of data in order for it to actually be useful in doing any predictions or doing any generation in that specific domain. And so domain specificity of data becomes a really important problem. And I know we've talked a lot about at least data-driven approaches to machine learning. Many of those same lessons apply when you're thinking about the design of neural networks and their application in the real world. So there's some electrical activity in your brain. Your neurons fire. They send a signal to your nervous system. It passes through your muscle fibers. They twitch, you might say, reach out your arm. And it looks like a free action on your part, but every one of those things, every single part of that process has been governed by a physical law, chemical laws, electrical laws, and so on. I love this clip from the movie Waking Life. I think they do a really fantastic job at least explaining the basic concept of how we think about signals moving to action. We're taking this same approach and trying to mimic it when we're designing neural networks. And the mimicry kind of stops there with that analogy, right? So I don't want you to lean in too hard into that analogy. You can start by conceptualizing neural networks as a model of the brain as a neural circuit with neurons connected by synapses. In this particular case, you can see a couple of images that describe how electrical signals actually fire through our biological neural networks as they are triggered by sensory inputs and other forms of activation. That activation actually results in, subsequent perception, memory, learning, reasoning, and even decision-making. And so early neuroscientists studied brain anatomy with a desire to understand how our squishy minds could be both predictable and creative. In 1906, Ramon y Cajal won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine with his colleague Camillo Golgi for their work on articulating the structure of the nervous system. So he spent his entire career investigating microscopic structures of the brain and created some of the most popular illustrations of branching structures of neurons. And these images, I would argue, really help seed our conception of the mind as a physical network of specialized cells. So when you're imagining neural networks, I think you're really drawing from images like these. But as we began to develop more nuanced structures of biological brains, neuroscientists also looked at the mechanics of these neural networks. In 1959, two neuroscientists published the first description of how different types of neural cells send specific kinds of information, describing how specialized cells could perform specific functions like visual perception. And so after almost 60 years of work, including that of researchers McCulloch and Pitts, we got the development of a neural network theory that suggested that one could create artificial neurons to perform, specific functions. Neurons that could receive input, process data, transmit information, and create outputs. And this was radical, right? It set the tone for the next set of work to come on actually thinking about how to codify some of these concepts and build digital twins of the brain and other parts of our body. So the anatomical understanding of the brain directly influence the abstractions that form artificial neural networks. Thus, the fundamental unit of an artificial neural network is the artificial neuron, in this case, a perceptron. A perceptron is basically an algorithm. It's a mathematical function that describes a simple, linear, binary classifier. It maps a vector of inputs to a binary output. Each input to the function may be weighted differently, influencing the importance of the input in determining the output. The researcher Frank Rosenblatt proposed a perceptron in 1957 as a digital system that could make sense of large populations of input elements by creating associations among them and providing a relevant response. This is always fascinating to me that we all actually started by thinking about physical electrical gates before we then started to represent these through code. The modern perception of the perceptron can be thought of as a single layer neural network, right? It simply accepts a vector of inputs that represent the problem, for example, words in a spam email. We provide a weight for each input, right? So how influential we humans think each of the inputs are to determining the output. For instance, naughty words would be given a higher weight, making it more likely to be classified as a spam email. The perceptron then enters a weighted sum of these inputs into the activation function that determines which output class should be chosen based on a set threshold. Too naughty, spam. Not enough, not spam. The concept here is that a perceptron is a very simplified neural network, right? It's one layer, calculations move forward or feed forward through the system, and a basic step activation function is used for a binary classification problem. So, while perceptrons, or a single-layer feed-forward neural networks, are great for binary classification problems, they're not really good for a lot of other problem areas. And they're also really sensitive to noisy or bad data, right? One tiny change in your input or in your weight can flip the output from a 0 to a 1 entirely. And so we don't have a lot of granularity in our outputs. I think of them as really good for toy problems, but then also for really thinking about how fundamental concepts work. And this is not to ditch on perceptrons. They're still used in research in many different ways, but ultimately, we should be thinking about perceptrons as a building block for neural networks, as a type of artificial neuron that actually leaves us with many, many more choices for what to do next as we start to build more complex networks. So the first choice that we have next is the choice of that activation function, right? So we can swap out that step function in a perceptron and put in either a sigmoid function, a 10 function, or even a rectified linear unit function. And each of these influence the way in which the model as a whole behaves and do require an understanding of the mathematical implications of each of those different types of activation functions. So you need to ask yourself questions, right? Like, is it a yes/no question? Is it a binary one? Does your data vary in some interesting nonlinear manner, right? You can then decide how you want to introduce nonlinearity into your model through choosing an activation function that enables the representation of more complex data. These days, one of the most popular activation functions in more complex neural networks is the rectifier or the ReLU unit shown at the bottom of the diagram. It's a little bit easier to compute than the smoother sigmoid function, and so you can do things a little faster and cheaper. But it's interesting, right? There's so many explainability questions that are still open in AI research. And so it means that we're not totally sure exactly why or how this works better than the others and for which problems exactly. And so this is an active area of research, and I just want to flag that. But if you switch out, for example, the activation on a perceptron to, say, a sigmoid function, you can now have a sigmoid neuron that doesn't just do binary classification, but it has the ability to express outputs that are non-integers. And now we're able to model that increased granularity, and the impacts of the noisy data are also reduced. So we said that we can use our artificial neurons as nodes in larger, more complex network architectures. Deep learning refers to neural networks that use many layers to model complex patterns. These middle layers are called hidden layers, given that we don't actively interface with anything other than the input and the output layer. So when you're designing a multi-layer network, we can think about the number of layers and the number of nodes per layer, right? These are your next two sort of decision points. Layers really enable hierarchical representations among data, but given the ripple effects of each of the mathematical constructs governing each node, it can be hard for humans to actively grapple with how every single node influences the output, right? And so there are a family of techniques that you can use to both trace the impacts through a neural network, decide how wide and how deep you want your model to be, decide what makes sense for your specific problem area, right? And so this is where things really start to get tricky when we're thinking about explainability of our neural networks, as well as thinking about, deliberate design of a neural network architecture. But one of the things that we were noticing as we started introducing layers in neural networks is that, right, so far we've been talking about the lessons moving forward through the system. And so it meant that being able to learn from your errors, learn from your mistakes, was something that was not yet incorporated into these feed-forward networks. Enter backpropagation. So backpropagation is essentially a feedback mechanism in neural networks. If you think back all the way to our conversations around control systems and cybernetics, right? We talked about feedback way back when, right? So feedback is really important when you think about how we actually learn. And so backpropagation allows for us to basically repeatedly adjust the weights of the connections in the network to minimize errors. You can think of this as a form of feedback used to inform the nodes in the hidden layer about the consequences of their weights on the final outputs. It's how we implement gradient descent, and most machine libraries will now actually handle backprop automatically. And so it's something that's usually under the hood, but it's still at least important for you to at least know this is happening, and it's how we get out of, for example, local maxima and local minima traps. And so there are many variations on neural networks like this one that allow for us to improve how we handle gradient descent problems, computational complexity, and many other issues when thinking about the design of a neural network. From here, I'm actually going to invite you to go check out the TensorFlow playground that I'm showing you an image of in this particular slide. This is a tool that you can use to basically set up a small toy neural network. You can see the impact of learning rate and activation function and batch size and all of the different concepts we've talked about in action. And I really think that one of the best ways to actually learn how neural networks work is to tinker with them. So you can switch out the different kinds of toy data sets under the hood, and then you can see, what does adding neurons do? What does adding layers do? What is changing the types of features that I actually feed and do? And then you can kind of think about what are the implications if I were to use this in my specific domain with my specific data set. There are a suite of tools just like this. There are lots of different libraries that you can use to implement your own neural networks. So these days, we don't actually have to build things from scratch. And that's part of the reason why I'm actually not going to go and double click into all of the details about each of these different pieces, because depending on what you want to do, depending on what you want to build, you actually need to go and kind of figure it out from here. And I know that's a big part of what the rest of these types of courses are intended for. So let's look at just one quick example of how neural networks have been changing the way in which we use computing. One way to think about how these deep learning networks function is to consider what we're trying to infer from the data. Let's say we want to identify faces. You can't just ask a perceptron to classify them into face, not face. We humans naturally solve this segmentation problem easily, identifying the eyes, the nose, and so on, and deciding if their relative positions make sense, putting them together in context, and then ultimately deciding, is this a face? Is this a human face? Is this just a picture of somebody's face or something else entirely? Right? Think about the number of CAPTCHAs that even you've solved that are then subsequently used to teach neural networks about how we decompose an image into meaningful parts. But taking that heuristic approach is besides the point in a neural network, right? We really want to be able to actually train based on what we're seeing. Okay, so let's look at a quick example. I have here a set of images of dogs and muffins. Take a quick gander and see if you can tell which one's a which. Cool, right? So we're looking for two eyes, we're looking for a nose, we're looking for their relative position, but it's still a fairly hard problem, right? Even for me, it's not totally obvious which ones of these are delicious things that I can eat and which ones are not. And so computer vision problems are sneaky like that, right? Even when you think you have a set of heuristics that will tell you the right answer, you realize that the heuristics are not everything that you need. You need all those other pieces that we humans are also using, right? Contextual information and so on and so forth. So if I think about how I see a face and juxtapose that onto how I might build a neural network, what I might hope for is that in those hidden layers, I was able to codify, is there an eye in the top left? Is there an eye in the top right? Is there a nose in the middle? And even for one of those boxes, I might want to decompose it into another set of questions of not just is there an eye in the top left, but is there an eyebrow? Are there eyelashes? Is there an iris? And so on and so forth, right? But this is me projecting how I as a human see a face. And it doesn't totally work that way when we're thinking about how a computer might process image of a face. Computers don't see eyes specifically, right? What they see is a matrix of numbers. And so an image is actually a set of pixels, and each of those pixels represent the lightness or darkness of that specific point. And so it means what we're asking when we're trying to train a neural network on a set of image data is for it to be able to process that matrix of numbers and then identify eye, not eye, face, not face, so on and so forth. This becomes a very complex problem because we're not just feeding one thing at a time. People's eyes are in different parts of their face, right? There's a lot of variation on the theme that means that you actually need something that is flexible enough to be able to both readjust the image, readjust those numbers, and identify the patterns and still be able to infer meaning from it. Sure. So one example of, right, taking those neural networks and then changing the different ways in which we either combine components, create additional layers, and so on and so forth is a convolutional neural network. A convolutional neural network was one of these early innovations that allowed for us to, yes, use these deep sets of layers, but it also took this approach of basically creating filters that allowed for you to then look at different components of the image, right? Again, just the numbers themselves. And each rectangular image was basically creating an image map or a feature map. And so what you ended up with was a very deep, highly complex structure that was really, in this particular case, identifying dog breed, for instance. Once again, I encourage you, this is a reading that I have also linked in the course itself, but there's a paper that is a review of deep learning methods that shows you a little bit more of how some of these different architectures work. And we could spend an entire year just talking about different types of neural network architectures, but I want to leave you with a couple of last thoughts as you think about where to go next. Neural networks can take a variety of different learning approaches. You can have supervised, unsupervised, and reinforcement learning under the hood. While we talk about deep learning as this large family of neural network architectures, there are a couple of really popular ones. Convolutional neural networks, or CNNs, are often have applications in computer vision. They're really good at these complex problems. Recurrent neural networks are often used in handling sequential data for complex problems like that, and really thinking about language models, right? So you're beginning to start to think about the sort of sequence of data inputs and identifying patterns in sequences of things. There are other variations on the theme of each of these, and I'll just give you one quick example. Something like a long short-term memory network, or an LSTM, is often used in, for instance, weather modeling, and it's a variation on the theme of an RNN. And modern generative AI tools also, right, vary on the theme of RNNs. One of the most recent innovations in neural networks are called transformers. These are a type of neural network again, and these are the foundation for language models, for generative AI, and many other pieces, right? And so if you sort of put these back together, you'll notice that there's, yes, the architecture of the neural network itself, but there are also questions around how do you pre-process that data, decide which features are important, decide which approach to learning you want to use. And then there are all these other supplementary components that you might want to think about. And the design of a neural network architecture is in and of itself a beautiful skill that, if you're so inclined, you can identify a slightly more technical course to dig in. As we zoom back out of this entire journey through neural networks, we can kind of reflect a little bit on what our original goals were, right? I think humans have been really interested in creating artificial life. And even as early as John Conway's Cellular Automaton, we have thought about ways to represent biological constructs through code and use that as a mechanism for us to both learn more about the world around us, learn more about ourselves, and then ultimately design tools that help us, right, explore the universe. In the last 5 years in particular, neural networks have exploded. And you can see how we have played and tinkered with style and structure, introduced all sorts of specialized cells, again, taking inspiration from the way in which the human mind works, the way in which other forms of life work. We have integrated a variety of complex statistical constructs to be able to allow for us to introduce predictability and structure into what would otherwise feel like the Wild West, and have started playing with the types of deep learning networks that have all sorts of dramatic implications on the world around us. You've probably heard concepts around, even just the energy use of different kinds of neural networks, or, our ability to be able to understand and explain exactly how and why data is getting transformed through these deep networks and resulting in very interesting and complex tooling. Ultimately, I feel like we're still chasing the same dream that we've had for a very long time, and it's to be able to understand emergent complexity and be able to build tools and design systems that allow for us to, right, either understand that better or then be able to grapple with the complexities of the world around us. I leave you with these lessons from John Conway's Game of Life. If you're interested, you can go check out some more. But on this image, you see a mathematical method for being able to generate different kinds of life constructs.